My name is Amardeep Gill, and I am the firm's lead on smart cities and future tech. And I wanted to set the scene for what you're about to hear this morning. Now, 2020 has seen and continues to see seismic changes in the way that we work, travel, socialize, and interact with each other. But it's also been the catalyst for digital innovation and change, which will be with us far beyond the end of the pandemic, which we all hope is sooner rather than later. Now, many sectors have been upended by the pandemic, and travel is one of them. And whilst we have seen travel patterns drastically alter, we've also seen new innovations emerge in the sector. And with my national and international hat on, I've got to say some of the innovations that we're seeing or about to see are coming from the West Midlands. So it's great to be able to host this event as part of Birmingham Tech Week to share some of those innovations with you, because as citizens in the region, we will all be benefiting from those in due course. I'm absolutely delighted to have some leading minds in the sector share their thoughts with you as part of this webinar. And before I hand over to them, in terms of formats, all of our speakers will be speaking first, and we will then have a Q&A session at the end. Please do put your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom, and we will take them in turn in due course. Can I thank you very much for joining us? And without further ado, I'd like to hand over to our first speaker, Mark Collins, Innovation and Integration Lead at Transport for West Midlands.
Thank you, Amardeep. So hopefully you can see, there we go, first slide. So yeah, good afternoon, good morning, everybody. So Mark Collins here from Transport for West Midlands. And the topic we're just going to cover in the next 5 minutes really is the impact of COVID and what COVID has meant to some of our transport industries over the last sort of 6 months. So if we go into the first slide, something you might recognise from other briefings that have been happening elsewhere, but this is really just looking at different modes and their patronage and usage over the last 6 months since March of this year. So this data doesn't take into account the last sort of couple of weeks worth of activity, but you can sort of see some of the generalised trends across here. And then where we started, if you follow each line, really, you can see how each of those has really been affected. So significant drop-offs in all forms of transport in March due to lockdown. And you can still see how some of those have matured over the sort of period since then. But actually, you can also see how most of these are significantly below where they were. And what's really interesting to pick up on this slide is that where you have rail, bus and the tram, each of those is running at near or over capacity in terms of the amount of coaches that are running when compared pre-COVID. But actually the levels of patronage and also allowable patronage because of social distancing on those is significantly down on where we saw levels before. So that's clearly having a really significant effect on those businesses. So if we go on to the next slide. So really what we tried to do here is just summarise some of the activity that is sort of going on in the region and some of the impact it's had. So as I alluded to, some of the commercial aspects and the viability of some of the businesses that we've got locally has been significantly affected, and through some of the DFT packages of support, etc., which are ongoing, those have had to be supported, etc., over the last sort of 6 months. Additional to that, and in order to facilitate some of the social distancing activities as well, some of those services had to be further supplemented. So additional services, elements of dynamic increases as well to facilitate the necessity for social distancing, for example, has meant actually further coaches and vehicles have had to be added to the fleet in order to facilitate that. So it's a bit of a double whammy of not only patronage down, but equally it's one whereby extra services had to be laid on in order to facilitate. When it comes to things like face coverings, etc., we've seen an initial sort of good adherence to that necessary activity. That has dropped off a bit over the last sort of few months, where we've seen increases in school travel, for example, come back into play. And actually what we find is that adherence in lower age groups is actually not as we'd hoped. So there's activity ongoing with local police, etc., to try and increase the level of adherence to face coverings on our services. Some of the other sort of more positive news is in this space, we've actually been active with the Emergency Active Travel Fund as well. So a number of local infrastructure changes have been observed where we've introduced cycle tracks, temporary cycle tracks. That initially led to some increases in cycling, which have fallen back a little bit as traffic has increased. And as Lucy, who's on the call as well, will go into a bit more detail later around some of the things that are e-scooter trials, which have also been taking place to try and mitigate some of the negative activity that's been happening in the space. So if we go to the next slide, the next few slides really just look at some of the legacy aspects of COVID. So really this slide is here just for context. And one of the activities that we've been involved with at TFWM is looking at sampling the population to understand opinion and perspective of public transport over the pandemic. So what's really salient to take from this slide really is that there's been 3 phases of sampling over the last 6 months. So May, June and September are the reference points to think about as we go on to the subsequent slides. So if we go on to the next slide, please. What you can see on this subsequent slide is really some of the reflections of people when asked about what their perceptions are and their confidence and their concern really about travelling on public transport. So you can see how the P1, P2 and P3 reference those timing slots. So that is the P3 being September, for example, and you can see a general decline in the amount of anxiety that exists. But actually, over 50% of the population still have extreme or moderate concern about travelling on public transport, which is a real concern to us, because actually that's a huge proportion of the population which wouldn't consider travelling on public transport. The subsequent slide, if we can move on to the next slide, is another cut of the same question, but it's looking at people specifically who have travelled in the last 7 days. So the salient conclusion from this is that those travelling on public transport, either they have to or they have chosen to, the level of anxiety is lower than the average for those individuals. But actually those who are not travelling, so used to or have never used public transport, the levels of concern in those groups is actually significantly higher. So what this is saying to us is that actually the ability for us to attract those people back to public transport is lessened because of COVID. So that's again a real concern for us. So the legacy for passenger use on these more sustainable forms of transport is clearly of a concern. On the final data slide that we have, this is looking at how people have travelled over the last 7 days to their place of work. So things that draw out as part of this conclusion: those that were travelling previously pre-COVID by car have largely continued to do so, with only a small percentage of people actually choosing a different mode of transport. Those that were travelling previously by public transport, so rail, tram, walking, etc., those who've actually changed their patterns of behaviour significantly on rail, as you'll see. And we know a large proportion of those people have actually gone into car usership as well. So in terms of a legacy position, we know that people have a level of anxiety about going back on public transport. We know travel behaviours have changed in terms of diverging away from public transport. So this is really something in terms of the legacy of COVID, which is a significant concern in terms of the sustainability of those modes of transport going forward. So the final slide that we've got is really just to try and summarise some of what I've just tried to talk about very quickly in 5 minutes. I think for us, we view the outlook as certainly mixed. Where traditional services are certainly struggling, we do see certain opportunities for new services, e-scooters being one of those. And where we may be seeing some environmental gains in terms of pollution levels, air quality improvements, that's coming at the detriment of those local services. It's also coming at the detriment of local businesses who need that footfall, who need those people in those town centres, etc. So we've got to strike some level of balance as a part of this, and clearly that is not going to be straightforward. As we've just listed some other conclusions there, which I've touched upon, but I think the message I really wanted to leave people with here is that the environmental and the inclusivity challenges that existed before COVID still exist today. And I think COVID actually presents some interesting opportunities in order for us to reassess what actually we need from a transport system. what it's going to mean to make that sustainable going forward, and how we marry that with changes that we've observed in people's behaviour and certainly commuting, and how we actually make a transport system that is adaptable and fit for purpose going forward. So I'll leave you with those thoughts, and yeah, thank you, and I'll look forward to your question.
That's great. Thank you very much, Mark. I'd like to hand over now to Lucy. Lucy is the Director of Public Policy at Voi Technology. Thank you for joining us this morning, Lucy. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Amardeep. So I don't have any slides, unlike Mark, so I'm just going to give you a quick overview. So for those of you who don't know, Voi Technology is a Swedish firm headquartered in Stockholm, founded in 2018. We just had our 2nd anniversary. We operate micro-mobility vehicles, so primarily e-scooters. We do also operate e-bikes and soon e-mopeds as well. We're active in around 50 different cities in 11 different countries around Europe. The UK is our newest country. We launched our first services in the UK on the 3rd of September. So we're just over a month into our first services. This is a completely new market to us. Many of you will know that the DfT changed the rules around using e-scooters on the 4th of July this year, and this has enabled trials of around 12 months to take place under very carefully controlled conditions. So the trials that we're running in Birmingham and elsewhere are part of those Department for Transport approved pilots. So our model is an on-street rental model. In Birmingham, we're operating initially in and around the city centre in a relatively small operating zone there, which we will scale out over time, working with Mark and his colleagues, and also with the city itself. Since launching in Birmingham on the 10th of September, we've recorded around about 20,000 rides. We have about 6,000 unique customers, and the majority of the rides that we're seeing are actually return customers. So it's people who have ridden with us previously are coming back to ride with us again. This is obviously really promising because this is a kind of novel vehicle for the UK. We want to make sure that we're not just seen as a novel option, but we're seen as a viable transport option that people begin to use as part of their transportation mix. We are carbon neutral in every market that we operate. So our operations in Birmingham are carbon neutral. We achieve this in a number of ways. So one of the things that we really focus on is using our fleet very, very efficiently. And that's a combination of things like making sure that the batteries are always fully charged, making sure that the vehicles are available in the types of places that people want to be able to hire one, so that they can always reach one without having to travel too far, and so on and so forth. We have the fleet of scooters that we use has swappable batteries, and what that means is that we can swap batteries in situ, so we can see remotely through our monitoring software the level of charge in a battery. If a scooter needs a fresh battery, we can send somebody out with fully charged batteries and swap it in the street. And what that means is there's very little downtime for that scooter. It also means that we're not having to transport whole vehicles to and from charging locations. So again, that just saves on congestion and saves on some of those emissions. The fleet that we use to do things like the swappable battery operations is an electric fleet of vehicles, and we also use electric cargo bikes as part of our operations. And the electricity that we use is all from renewable sources. So our operations are about, per passenger kilometre, they're about 1/4 in terms of carbon emissions of even the newest and cleanest electric cars at the moment. So this is a very sustainable, very kind of low carbon transport option. We know from our other markets that there are two things that we really focus on in all the markets we're present, and it's no different for Birmingham. We focus on mode shift, so particularly from the car. So obviously In the UK, a vast majority of car journeys are really quite short distances, so these contribute a lot to local congestion and pollution, and average occupancy of cars is also very low. So one of the things we're really targeting is trying to take some of those journeys and swap them for scooter journeys. And then the second thing that we focus on is integrating with public transport. We have in some of our other markets very deep integrations with public transport. So we have products that are sort of integrated ticketing or payment products. Again, we can help people with the sort of what we call the first and last mile problem in the industry, which is about people who maybe choose not to use public transport because it's difficult to reach their nearest transportation hub. Obviously, in the current time, Mark's just been talking about the reduced capacity on reduced patronage on public transport, and the fact that people are choosing different options at the moment. This is a real opportunity for us to try to introduce some of those people to a new mode of transport. Scooters are obviously, they're used in the open air, so they're a little bit more COVID safe than an enclosed environment. We also disinfect the fleet very regularly, and we have special measures on the fleet as well, such as copper tape on the handlebars that inactivates the majority of coronaviruses. So our early results from Birmingham, as I said, are very promising. People are really embracing the scooters as a new mode of transportation. We're still very early, but we are collecting some data about how the service is being used. The Department for Transport are also collecting data from these trials, as are Transport for the West Midlands. So over the duration of these 12 months, we will really start to build up a picture about how e-scooters can fit into the transportation mix in cities, and who's using them, and what are the types of journeys they're making. So that's a very quick overview of what we're up to in Birmingham. I'm sure there will be questions for me and Mark on that later in the conversation, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Thanks very much, Lucy. And congratulations to everybody in the inroads that they're making into the UK market. So it's great to see you come back to some of that in a little bit, but in a moment. But on to our next speaker. I'd like to invite Chris Thompson to share a little bit more about what's been going on. Chris is the CEO of USmartThing, who have done a bit of pivoting over the pandemic. So looking forward to hearing a little bit further about that. Over to you, Chris. You're on mute at the moment. Chris, you're still on mute, so just need for you to unmute yourself.
Thanks, Amandeep, and yes, thanks for that introduction. I really appreciate it. I do have one or two slides, so hopefully I'll whiz through them. Hopefully everybody can see something saying USmartThing. Guiding people to venues and events the smart way. Can you see that, Amandeep? Just nod. You can't. Okay, it's not very helpful, is it? Let's try sharing that. Let's try sharing that again. There we go. Thank you guys for your nods and thumbs up. That's greatly appreciated. So we launched a proposition mid last year, all about guiding people to venues and events the smart way. And then of course COVID hit, and so we have spent really the last 12 months pivoting, and I'll explain a little bit about how we did that. Our core proposition really was based on the fact that in and around the city there's almost constant redevelopment. Google keeps sending people the wrong way down one-way streets in Birmingham, which is obviously very frustrating for drivers. Access to venues and events is increasingly difficult as we continue to regenerate and redevelop the environment in which we live. Of course, if you're heading to an event that you paid a ticket for and you have a terrible journey, no matter how good the show is, it can ruin the experience. So that was the sort of initial problem that we focused on addressing. The way that we do that is with a travel assistance service which integrates with venue and event services. It's designed to give people the confidence and assurance to travel and allow for access for all different types of audiences. And what we do is we enable venue and event operators to design a bespoke route to their establishment or venue for a specific type of customer. Could be people driving, using public transport, or people with a disability. We deliver the service via a very simple embedded web-based interface, and so it's designed to integrate within the websites of venue and events, transport operator services, or any third-party touch point. Could be social media or indeed a mobile app. The way we do what we do is by designing access points. So on the right hand of the screen, we have a festival website. On the left, we have the same festival website, but we've actually mapped specific access points for different types of person, guiding them to, in this case, a pop-up car park with a driving route in and a driving route out. There's also walking routes around the festival site for facilities, merchandise, and to catch the main act, let's say, at the main stage. We then publish that for stakeholders, and here's an example that we did with the Diver Festival last year. People argue about the right and wrong route. We then hack those routes together to get a very bespoke route put in place. We then publish it on a operator's website, in this case a festival, Diver Festival here in Birmingham, and we start to capture data. And there's data of attendees to Diver Festival for 2019, from 2 days, in fact, before the event. And of course, underneath each one of those location pins is a very detailed route and modal choice. So that's been our sort of business usual proposition, really. What we're trying to do is be part of a collaborative sort of cloud-based ecosystem. So just moving from left to right, we embed a travel assistant in a venue or a transport operator's website. We have a dashboard, an analytics tool to allow people to visualize and capture that data. And over on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see how we capture that data across all of the venue and event activities. And this could be people attending university campuses or open days, or even a shopping centre or a hospital. And so we build up a big data picture, really, of who's travelling or who's planning to travel, how and why. Since COVID hit, of course, I mentioned that we've pivoted, and an example of that is the travel assistant that I've put on the screen now, which is designed for West Midlands Metro services. And here we've got a journey from Telford to the Town Hall in the UK. What we've done here is we've created a hybrid journey, and so it defaults to drive you to the outskirts of Birmingham, in this case, a park and ride facility on the outskirts in West Bromwich, and you can then park there and use public transport to get into the centre of the city, reducing congestion and emissions. And of course, we'd love to introduce Voi scooters as an option that we serve to people attending venues and events in that park and ride. In summary, then, this was a sort of try and predict the future of mobility, to some degree at least. So we think that the future of mobility will be based on understanding people's intent to travel. And the three sort of pillars of that, we believe, are really identity governance and administration technologies, allowing for data sharing across the supply chain, across operators. The technology is all well and good, but of course it has to be underpinned by legal frameworks for data sharing, and a key sort of part of our business is brokering those arrangements and actually adjusting GDPR statements to enable data sharing to be compliantly distributed in accordance with the preferences of the end user. And last but not least, of course, pulling in real-time network and destination management data so that we can hack all those things together. And when we do, we have a picture of when, where and why you want to go and the best possible options to get there. I think if we can arrive at a collaborative system to deliver that, we should have a much more optimized mobility infrastructure moving forward. Thank you very much. Sorry about the hiccup with the slide share at the beginning.
Quite all right, thank you very much, and it's great to see uSmartThing, pivot in the way that they have, and I'm sure we'll explore that a little bit further in a moment. And now over to Robin as our final speaker for the Q&A. Morning, Robin. Robin is the CEO and lead technologist at Immense. It's great to have you here, Robin. Over to you.
Great, thanks, Amardeep, and great to be here. And like Lucy, I'm going to talk to you and talk about what we do and how I think it's hopefully relevant and of interest in Birmingham and in the context of Tech Week. So Immense, we're a 5-year-old now. So we're a company that came out of a set of research initiatives looking at decision making around transport. So you've heard from other speakers already about the specific disruptions that we're seeing over the last year, and also a lot of the opportunities that are coming through with new tech and new services. We set up, with support from the Department for Transport and government a few years ago, to try and help people make good decisions about how cities and how services can be developed and provided, and then adapted operationally to be able to respond to changes. So what we do is we build digital worlds, and then we provide access to them in a platform to our users to simulate alternative futures. So you can test thousands of different tomorrows, thousands of different next Thursdays, or 2025s, or whatever planning horizon or decision-making horizon you need to look at. We focused that initially in the UK. We've also been operating globally. We have client bases internationally, where we're trying to support people in understanding how to deploy different fleet services and working with the cities around how to manage infrastructure changes. So in the context of Birmingham, we're delighted to be one of the winners of the 5G pilot program, which I'll talk more about in a second. But what we're looking at there is actually some really recurrent problems that we all run into all the time. So Chris spoke about it a moment ago, where a bad journey to an event can really ruin your experience. And actually a lot's changing dynamically every day. So Birmingham and the West Midlands are undertaking a lot of land development programs. There's a lot of work, there's a lot of street works on the roads. And that means that the best way of getting somewhere is different today, tomorrow, and in the future. And the people responsible for the network are trying to find good ways of mitigating that and communicating it ahead of time. So what we're doing in the 5G program is working with our partners, Black, Elgin, and the University of Warwick, to take 5G data and help us get a nearer to real-time representation of the system. So being able to estimate what is best right now and how an operator can make use of these simulation tools to make a better informed decision about how to adapt the management of the network. It's a really practical operational problem. And for us, it's very exciting. It's going from our early work looking at autonomous vehicle fleets, which are going to be transformational in many ways, but are probably still a few years away, to actually bringing this back to using the same technologies and applying them today for benefit in the West Midlands and elsewhere. So that's a relatively quick canter through. For wider context, we're a UK SME. We were founded in Milton Keynes. We did have offices in different places around the country. We now are fully distributed, like many people, working from our bedrooms in different parts of the world. So yeah, really pleased to be here. Glad to pick up any questions in the panel.
Thank you very much all. That's been really interesting to hear that. And if I can kind of kick off some of the questions that have been coming in and the ones that I've been thinking about as well. Now, Mark, I think this is probably one for you. We've been asked, should infrastructure still be a priority? And I think my take from that is, is the big capital expenditure in travel infrastructure still going to be a priority? I know there's been a lot of talk about, some of the big projects that we're seeing, whether they're still warranted if, the numbers of travellers are going to reduce on a permanent basis, which none of us can predict at this moment in time. Now, should we be reprioritising monies in a different way?
It's a nice contentious question to start off with, isn't it, really, that one?
Indeed it is.
I suppose I'll be careful in what I say, because there's clearly levels of commitment that are going on at a regional level and a national level. But I think, back to Chris's point, actually, in some respects, about what do we envisage as the future of mobility. And I think my personal view on this is one whereby we need to give a level of choice to consumers, and I think the diversification of that choice is something that is going to grow, and that is absolutely necessary if we are going to achieve our objectives of people traveling sustainably and not just relying on the car. So I think there is an inherent requirement to carry on investing in infrastructure developments which grow that portfolio of a viable choice for people. I think there'll also be a move, and it's been shown in some of the talks here, around the commodity with which we are going to sell in the future. I think is a more end-to-end mobility experience as opposed to a journey on a particular mode of transport. So I think we're going to look for a more joined up position where you go from point A to point B, which might encompass more than one mode, but you have a more managed view of how that works. That might work better with your lifestyle. It might have a level of incentive to do this, that, or the other, so that you can travel more sustainably, etc. So I think, in a nutshell, I don't think we're ever going to get away from having some of those core functions that define elements of our network. I think what you're going to see is a diversification of some of those, and also a proliferation of more modes for more people more of the time. And I think that will create a system whereby people will migrate, hopefully, towards a more measured view about whether they need their car or not. Because at the minute we design everything around the car, and that really, from an environmental perspective, is not a sustainable way to keep on going. So I think if that answers some of your question, I know that it sort of throws up more debate there.
I think it doesn't, and perhaps I'd like to draw Robin into that conversation as well, so for some of your thoughts on whether big capital infrastructure should still be the priority.
Yeah, I've just put a note back into the Q&A chat. It's a really good example of where none of us knows what the future is going to look like for mobility. We all have different perspectives on what might be good changes to make. There are a lot of really great objectives for us to try and satisfy, and they contradict quite often, and they're challenging to deliver. And there's lots of routes to get there. The schemes and all of the changes, we need to be able to test them before we do them. So to the extent that we can, we want to be able to test how much benefit we would hope to get from the improved infrastructure, and how we can use it, and how we might use it differently post-COVID. So one of the things that's very striking in Mark's data is that the road traffic has recovered much more quickly than the other modes, and that we're running with capacity constraints still. So quite likely we will need additional infrastructure, but we definitely need to think about it differently, because the travel demand is likely to look different as we respond. And so a lot of the scenarios that we would have run historically probably will need to be looked at slightly differently. So it is impossible to say should it be the priority, because there are obviously a lot of things competing for resource and attention at the moment, but we're starting to have the tools that enable us to inform those decisions a lot better, and I think it's a good opportunity to make use of them.
I'm not sure if Chris or Lucy had any views on that as well. Perhaps Lucy, you first.
Yeah, so I think some of the points made are ones that we would certainly echo. I think for us and for micro-mobility, and having some dedicated infrastructure is important to make this mode sticky. So I think many of you listening will know that within the UK, scooters are not legal on pavements. They have to be used on roads and in cycle lanes. So certainly any infrastructure, any investment in cycle infrastructure is also very useful to encourage people to use micro mobility. But I think also if we look at, for instance, and I think Robin's just sort of made the point, and Mark as well, the fact that in a lot of our towns and cities we have designed the urban space around using the car. And I think I saw some stats in London where something like 5% of all land space in central London is dedicated for car parking. So I certainly think there are things that we can do which just place the car a little bit less centrally in our lives, and start to release some of that land space for different purposes. And I think this means it will make it easier to use some of these other modes, whether it is for things like use of parking and just dedicated infrastructure to be able to use these modes. So I think this is one of the things that we would highlight as being important. It's really about looking at what we have currently and how we can repurpose that, just to put some of these other modes on more of a level playing field, but also to give them some of the infrastructure they might need for things like parking or charging.
And Chris, did you have any thoughts on the point? And I know there's a question that's coming for you that you have answered, but for the benefit of everyone, perhaps answering that question as well. But first, capital infrastructure priority, should it be the priority?
I'm going to say no. I'm going to say understanding people's behaviour should be the priority. I totally agree with and respect what Lisa said there about facilitating infrastructure for more sustainable modes of transport. But I think historically, and I know this is changing, but I think infrastructure spend has been based on a reaction to a sort of key pinch point on the roads, a traffic issue normally. And we seem to have a propensity to sort of want to build additional ring roads or additional sort of trunk lanes in and out of cities based on historical information about traffic congestion. And I think that needs to be completely refocused on understanding behaviour and really building infrastructure to facilitate the people's intent and the behaviour that we want to achieve moving forward and the problems that we've experienced in the past.
Thanks very much. And there's a question that you were asked and you've answered about, is this a permanent pivot for USmart thing, or is it going to be back to normal as it was before the pandemic?
Yeah, it potentially is permanent in that we realised, I think, as the pandemic hit quite quickly that we have a bespoke travel planning service that can be used by a whole different range of stakeholders. And so Transport for Wales are using it currently to ration the amount of people who use specific train services. And I think this rationing, for want of a better word, or moderating the use of different services and nudging behaviours is something that we'll stick with. And I think that probably does mean maintaining a very strong public sector focus for ourselves. That said, as the cultural, sports and entertainment sectors re-emerge out of COVID in whatever the timeline is, we're absolutely in pole position to be able to work with those venue and event and destination management operators to get audiences safely back to in and out of venues. So it's a combined strategy moving forward for us.
I know Robin's touched on it, and there's been a question about 5G, but both USmart Thing and Immense have been successful in WM5G's grant allocation for travel innovation. And I think the question has been, is 5G going to fundamentally change the way that we travel, and if so, how? Perhaps some insights from both of you, Chris first perhaps, and then Robin, about 5G and why actually it's not just a means by which we can communicate on our mobile phones. It's actually far greater potential in terms of a technology across so many sectors and so many activities that we undertake.
I'm not sure if it's going to 5G itself is going to fundamentally change the way we travel. That said, I think it's going to really enhance the way that we deliver services. I think the data capture capability that 5G has for real-time information, specifically around crowd proximity in and around stations and events, can really be helpful as we sort of manage the recovery from COVID. And I think at the consumer side of it, people probably saw Apple's play for 5G announced yesterday, which is sort of quite exciting for us. I think the difference it makes for us as a travel planning business is we can make travel planning a lot sexier. It's pretty boring and utilitarian, isn't it? Planning a journey from A to B. And what we're looking to do is work with the cultural sector to actually overlay really engaging augmented reality content on top of maps, so that we actually create the journey becomes part of the whole experience and much more engaging. And by doing that and making travel planning part of an experience, we can capture a lot more data and do a lot better job of delivering services.
And Robin, did you have some thoughts as well? I know that you've answered some of it in the chat as well.
Yeah, I agree with Chris that the opportunity with 5G is to improve the service delivery and the journey experience and the experience of accessing goods and services more generally, probably. And in some cases, I think that will mean that we have less of a need to travel, and it might, for some types of trip, become a substitution. There's lots of little bits of evidence around this. A lot of them contradict, and I think that's something that we're only really going to learn as we start to roll out some of these services and see how to use the tech effectively, and fundamentally what people want to use it for, because it's exciting. I mean, there are some really cool things that people are now able to do on the move with 5G enabled equipment. From a company point of view, for us, again, Chris touched on it, the data availability or the potential data availability from those networks could, and we hope will be, a game changer in terms of how we can get timely, accurate information about the state of a city. Not to the point of tracking individuals, but to be able to understand the loading in different parts of the community and what's changing, so that we can support operators in making really good decisions. And for us, that's a lot of the point of the trial program that we're engaged in now, is to spend the next 15 months or so building and testing some of those tools in the West Midlands, so that we can learn well and hopefully take those benefits more widely around the country and beyond.
Lucy, we have a few questions for you in the Q&A. But to kick off with, in terms of the take-up of the trials in the West Midlands, and actually the ones in the UK that have been during a pandemic, how do they compare to the other projects that you ran across Europe and elsewhere in terms of travel journeys, etc., and take-up and using that as a new form of mobility?
Yeah, good questions. I think the first thing to say is that the initial adoption of the service in all of our UK markets has been a lot higher than the initial adoptions we've seen in other markets throughout Europe. I think it's important to say that one of the key differences is that in our other European markets, we haven't done those launches during some of the COVID restrictions, so that has probably made a difference. It's hard for us to be able to sort of, I suppose, kind of normalise or standardise for the difference that has made, but we've certainly seen much higher adoption in the UK so far. In terms of the types of journeys that people are making, we're seeing some similarities. So typical journey length in the UK is sort of between 1 to 3 miles on average, which is also an interesting journey length in terms of thinking about car substitution, because this is the type of journey length which a lot of people will often feel is a little bit too far to walk, or might take a little bit too long to walk. So they might normally revert to their car and choose their car. So we are in that kind of sweet spot for mode substitution. I think in terms of kind of other data about the service, it's probably a little bit too early to draw any kind of hard and fast conclusions just yet, because there is also, I think, whenever we arrive in a city, there's also a little bit of a novelty factor in terms of just being something new and different. And there will be people who maybe want to try the service for that reason, and conversely also people who maybe don't want to try the service just yet because they feel quite unfamiliar with a new form of transport. So I think we'll know really within the next, as I said, these trials are for 12 months or so. So I think at the end of that time, we'll be able to make a bit more of a confident assessment about how people have been using the scooters. But we'll obviously continue to look at the data along the way as well.
And the other questions, what measures have Void taken to ensure safety of riders and pedestrians? I understand that helmets are not required. And the second one, Lucy, do Void provide an API to allow third parties the ability to retrieve information about scooter location availability? We use something similar in Dublin to encourage bike use from our corporate web app. Lucy, what are your thoughts on that?
On the API, we do have an API. that we can, sorry, I'm getting a bit of feedback, sorry if I sound a bit distracted. So we do have an API. I will, if you're happy for me to, Matthew, I will get your details from Amardeep and I can share that information with you. And then for Pam's question, this question on safety I think is going to be quite hard to do justice to in the time available. So I'll just try to focus on some of the main points. I think the first thing to say is that matters of road safety and measures to ensure road safety comprise many, many different elements. So there's kind of no single answer to this, but I mean, broadly speaking, it is a mixture of education. So this is about educating our own riders who use the scooters, but also educating other road users, such as car drivers, bus drivers, HGV drivers. It's also, thanks Matthew, it's also a matter of enforcement in some cases. So one of the things we're doing in Birmingham is we're working closely with West Midlands Police. In fact, we're actually paying for some police patrols just for the first few weeks of the trial, first few weeks of the service. And it's also a matter of engineering. So this is about actually the kind of the design of the vehicle and some of the kind of inbuilt measures in the vehicle to ensure it's as safe as possible. So in terms of education, if I take the first of those, one of the things that we have at Voi is what we call our online traffic school. It's ridelikvoiler.com. If you want to go and register and complete the school, you can do. You don't have to download our app to be able to do that. You can just go to the website. This is a series of questions which are based on the highway code. The whole school is accredited by Drive Tech from the AA. And this just takes you through some of the rules of the road. It points out some of the different features of the scooter, such as where the bell is located, when to use it. It talks our users through things like what good and considerate parking behaviour looks like for the scooters. It takes them through different road scenarios and just covers issues like who has right of way in different road situations. So we incentivise people to complete that. We give them some ride credit for completing that. We also do some education on the ground. So we have a team of what we call Voi ambassadors who patrol our operating areas, and they can actually just approach people who might be using the scooters. We also do this with the police patrols I talked about. And this is just really about giving people education about what the legal rules are for using scooters in the UK, but also being available to answer any questions about the service or how the scooter works or any of those sorts of things. We do some safety events on the ground as well. So these are an opportunity for people to, if they're unfamiliar with scooters and they'd like a little bit more support for their first go on a scooter, they can have that with a more experienced rider. So they can have somebody sort of walk them through some of the kind of key features and just get them to a point where they feel more comfortable and more confident. In terms of enforcement, I talked about the work we're doing with the police. One of the things that we have done in the UK, actually in response to some early observations from our pilots around the UK, is that we've fitted the whole fleet of scooters with unique ID plates. So they're not quite sort of vehicle registration plates. They're a slightly different format, and these vehicles aren't required to be registered at the DVLA, but they are unique codes. And this means that if the police or a member of the public or one of our ambassadors on the ground sees somebody misusing a scooter, that there is some accountability there. We can enforce against it. So it's obviously something that's not present for instance, cyclists who are not required to have a number plate, but we do now have them on all of our fleets across the UK, and that's something that we have been working quite closely with the police on as well. So I think the key thing to say here is that these are trials. The purpose of trials is to sort of I suppose to learn what kind of good practice looks like, but also more importantly for in a year's time, when the Department for Transport is looking at these trials and trying to decide whether to introduce primary legislation around use of e-scooters in the UK, what that should look like and what the particular conditions should be. I think we are aware that in all of the cities we operate, there are also instances of private scooters being used illegally on public roads. These scooters aren't subject to the same constraints of the trial scooters. So Our scooters have a maximum speed of 15.5 miles per hour, which is the Department for Transport requirements. In many cases, actually, we cap our speed lower than that. So, you know, that's a maximum, not a target. There are a lot of private scooters around. In fact, I saw a figure recently that suggested maybe 200,000 in the UK, which have a very different specification, different conditions, aren't insured, and don't have a number plate, and so on and so forth. So I think one of the things that were really valuable from these trials is really understanding if these are to be legalised on a permanent basis in the UK, how we can do that in a way that's safe for everybody.
Thanks very much, Lucy. Mark, can I hand over to you? There's quite a few questions that have come in. Any thoughts on how the e-scooter trial is going in the West Midlands? And a few questions for you. Are there any projects that TFWM have got going on that perhaps are going to hit the consumer fairly soonish, and if you can talk about those, and how important do you think the green agenda is to future change? There's lots there, I'm sorry.
Some additional meaty topics to throw into the mix there. So I suppose just a quick reflection on some of the stuff that Lucy's spoken about. You know, I think as I said earlier, e-scooters is an interesting one because it again adds a level of diversity into that portfolio. They won't be for everybody, but equally, if we can encourage some sustainable journeys that are safe, there is a value proposition there. Equally, to unlock people that are locked into current modes of transport, say bus travel, for example, they can't access anything else. Scooters might be a way for them to diversify the way they get around, which might open up other opportunities. So I think you know, the trials are a learning experience, and will be for the next 12 months. And you know, we're committed to learn as much as we can from that activity. So it's really good that we've got Voy on board, and we're making, you know, really aggressive developments all the time in the way the scheme is run. In terms of other stuff that we've got going on, I think the way to split this, we've got a sort of research set of programs that are part funded through the DFT and others. And then we've got some sort of major infrastructure developments around Metro and Sprint, which is sort of our quick bus service. In terms of some of the other research bits, so the Future Transport Zone programme is one that's running within the West Midlands now, which is actually the programme I look after. And that is actually, to the points that made earlier, really interested in understanding more the behaviour and the consumer needs that are driving levels of transport requirement. And it's trying to understand a link between those drivers and actually, if you had unlimited access to different forms of transport, where would people go? What incentivisations do they need? What disincentivisations do they need to not do current bad practice? And it's really just understand what those connections are. And then we've got other things that are focusing on CAV, so connected autonomous vehicles, and developing a test bed for those in the West Midlands as well as the 5G activity, and really just trying to understand fundamentally what connectivity in transport actually means to us. Does it mean you can manage a network better? Does it mean that you can introduce new services which are more attractive to people to use? So there's a huge amount, and to be honest, over the next sort of 5-10 years, we see a massive amount of revolution in this space, and COVID's sort of really just accelerated that in some respects. As I said, it's an opportunity to redefine how we see transport working for people, and maybe become less mode centric, so to speak. You know, we've always had bus, tram, train. Actually, can you make that an ecosystem that talks to each other, and what does that mean holistically? And in terms of the green element, I think fundamentally this is driven by a realization that we can't carry on as we are. You know, I think we are in a very unsustainable position whereby in the West Midlands we've got something like 60% car travel, and 63% of those are single occupant car journeys. So we've got a huge amount of reliance on vehicle transport, and you know, we've got pollution and congestion problems that have got to be addressed, which are not squarely all at the car, clearly, but that forms a significant part of that. And it's really, probably more than anything, is about educating people that they can have alternatives out there that doesn't necessarily affect the way that they want to live their lives, but that can be done in a way that actually is beneficial for the region. So huge amounts have to go out, but yeah, there's a social, environmental and economic position on each of these, and whenever you make a change to one, it influences the balance on the others. So you've got to be mindful about how that is, and historically we've probably always factored to the economic, maybe the detriment to the social and environmental, and I think a level of rebalancing is required when we redesign and consider this sort of future mobility perspective. So a really exciting place to be, I think, is the caveat statement with all this. So hopefully that answers some of those questions to an extent.
Questions, and I think you do, Mark. Thank you very much. And any other thoughts on the importance of the green agenda to mobility in the future from our other panelists? Robin, Lucy, Chris, turning to you.
Yeah, definitely. I just answered the questioner online. I mean, obviously, I think the green agenda is pivotal to the future of transport. Like many people on the call, I've got young kids, and they're really, really worried, and I'm really worried for them as well. However, I think there's a real danger here around competing agendas. At the end of my little turn, I said that the future of mobility was based on understanding when, where, and why people want to go, and the best options to get them there. And I think the question we've got to ask ourselves is the best options for who? Is it the best option for the person travelling that we're looking to optimise? Is it the best option for the state that we're looking to optimise, and therefore the society as a whole? Or is it the best option for the transport operator providing the service that we're looking to optimise? And those are all really competing agendas that potentially hold back the overall green agenda, which I think needs more work.
Robin, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's just to add a few perspectives. So one of the areas, it's one of the questions actually in terms of what we've seen change. So there's been a huge upsurge in initiatives and interests around electrification, around vehicle fleets, around charge points, around different types of organisation, trying to understand how they embrace that and get involved in it early. And that's, and to pick up on Chris's point, one of the things we've always output from the system is estimates of energy use and environmental impacts. But increasingly those metrics are the things that the customers want to be assessing as part of how they evaluate whether scenario A is better than scenario B or not. So there are a lot of competing trade-offs, but in a classic, I would say this, wouldn't I? One of the most important things is to be able to test them and compare them on their merits and get objective numbers about, well, what might the impacts be of project A versus B versus C. And it's always hard to do that, but getting it out in the open and making it transparent about how we're comparing things is a really helpful part of that, I think.
Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more, Robin.
You. And Mark, you touched on autonomous vehicles. One of the questions we've had is, what are your thoughts on autonomous vehicles, the role that they'll play? And I suppose their gradual rollout is an option of mobility for broader consumer consumption.
Yeah, I mean, AV is an interesting one. Having in a past life been involved in programs of work, sort of developing AV, and Lucy's probably got a position on this as well, given her history. But I mean, for me personally, AV will likely play a role in this. There are some ethical and moral positions on autonomy that obviously still need work, but I think where AV is going to have value is where it satisfies a purpose, a real purpose that can't be satisfied, otherwise, or it is an undesirable position for other employment, for example. So I think that is something that's going to sort of be part of this portfolio. There's some technical stuff that needs to be figured out in that space still. So I think we're a little distance away, but we've got to find the use cases that actually work for people more than anything else. You don't want it just for autonomy's sake. Is the phrase I'd use.
Thank you, Mark. and conscious of time, we've come to the end of the time that's been allotted to this. Can I thank you all for participating this morning. It's been a really interesting chat with lots of issues, and actually I think it shows that the mobility sector, while subject to a lot of change at the moment due to the pandemic, I think the future, actually there's a lot of opportunities to do some really interesting and wonderful things. Thank you very much for joining us. And actually, Robin, I think your comment to one of the questions, 2020 has been a real year of change, but actually what follows it, I think, will even be more seismic in terms of the world of mobility. And thank you for all for giving us a flavour of that this morning. On behalf of Troughs and Hamlins and Birmingham Tech Week, thank you all for joining us today. Have a good one.